Hi, everyone. We're going to start the way we always start to see if you can hear me. So can you guys hear me? Just quickly type into the chat before we get going. And Kathy says no. Here we go again. Simona says yes. Okay, Kathy, it's you. Okay. Kathy, you jumped the gun. I should know that because I type it in the chat, but you see the chat before you actually hear me, but that's just the way the time delay goes. All right. Okay. All right. So we'll just get started here. So first of all, let me ask you this, because we're going to be talking about clients who are coming to you with decisions already made about diet, right? So in the past, they just came to you. They hadn't really had much of an opinion one way or another. This is what I remember when I graduated in the year 2000. Well, actually, it was 1999, but that's beside the point. They didn't really have much of an opinion as to what they should behave, or dealing with people with more opinions than we have in the past. So what I basically would just want to ask you all is, have you been finding there's an increase in the number of people who've already made a dietary decision to either eat a certain way, follow a certain diet, banish a certain food or foods from their diet before they come to you, so that you aren't dealing with a clean slate? You're not starting from square one. They're not actually coming to you as the expert, so to speak. They're coming to you almost to see what you can do, right, for them. Kathy's saying yes, they got an idea from TV or another ad. Diana's saying yes. Jennifer's saying yes. I think this is why it's important to have this conversation that we're going to have tonight. So I'm just going to get started. Oh, Heather says 100%. So many people saying they want to try keto, low carb, or intermittent fasting, etc. Lucia says yes. Yeah. So this is kind of what the issue is. Sandra's saying definitely most clients have taken one or more foods out of their diet. And I'm not, again, that's not as shocking to me as having an opinion about it, because we did have that in the past where an MD would suggest that they not eat, cholesterol foods, or, watch their salt intake or whatever. Sylvia says most people have no idea what to do for their health. Well, and that's the dilemma we face. And Kayla's saying people always want to just subscribe to one diet. Margot is also confirming she's experienced this, and Aliona is saying the belief that saturated fats are bad still prevails. Well, and that's basically, kind of where we're at, is that people they haven't abandoned anything they thought before. They just added new things to it, and they don't seem to be aware that they conflict. So there are a lot of people out there who are low carb and low fat, and they don't understand because they don't know enough about food to know that those things actually don't go together. That's like being no food, basically, if you're going to be low carb and low fat. So we've got a lot. I think it's a little more difficult for us. So we got to have this conversation. All right. So I'm just going to pull up the PowerPoint, and I'm going to go to reading view. All right, and you can all see that. I can see that you can see that. All right, so let's get started here. So when I started promoting this, I asked this question, does the truth matter anymore? Because it seems that facts don't count, and we seem to be much more ruled by our beliefs. And I think a lot of what we are seeing when we see these different people with these different opinions about what they should or shouldn't eat, it's more about beliefs than it has anything to do with facts. Now, in the past, and again, when I'm saying past, I'm talking about when I graduated, we had to deal with the difference between sort of the conventional perspective and the alternative perspective. So back then, conventional was, anti-saturated fat and watch the sodium, and we were more, well, balance the sodium with the potassium, and you need a certain amount of fat in order to be healthy, and it was that kind of conundrum, sort of black and white. But today we have differences within the alternative perspective. So we have the conventional and the alternative sort of overlapping in some areas. And then within the alternative perspective, there are, vegans on one side and paleo on the other. Or if you want to go even further, ketogenic, which shocks me to no end that somebody would be ketogenic with regard to having a holistic perspective. But anyway, whatever. And I don't have a problem with special diets. And I'm not saying vegan per se is a special diet, although it's a difficult diet. And if it's not done well, someone will have health issues. Same with paleo, same with just about any type of diet. And I'm not against having a certain restrictive type diet in a healing perspective. But a quote I was reading in a book, which I'm about to mention in a couple of slides here, it was basically that if you're doing a diet for a healing perspective, at some point you're supposed to heal, and you don't keep following that diet just because it got you back to a normal state. If it's really done its job, you should go back to being able to eat, in a much more comprehensive way. And the example she gave was, you don't put a cast on a leg that isn't broken. And so a lot of what we're seeing when people are being presented with this information, they don't necessarily have a broken leg, but they're deciding to do these dietary interventions just in case they break their leg. And it just doesn't work that way. So it's kind of a mess. So why are these clients being misled? Well, first of all, it's very easy to do. We are in an era where food and health in particular has become a product that you sell, and there's no oversight. So nobody is looking at what people are writing in books, and nobody is looking at what are being written on blog posts. And yes, you can find, somebody says this on a blog post, so somebody else will write another blog post to counter that. You can find all that, but there's really no sort of oversight of what people can and cannot say. If this was the food industry or the supplement industry, they can't make claims the way people can about, different foods when they write books or it's a blog or a program that they have. So people can basically just say anything they like, and it's up to the consumers to basically have enough wherewithal to understand what they are saying or not saying is true. And politics plays a big role as well. So I just mentioned the broken leg analogy. It actually came from this book, Death by Food Pyramid by Denise Minger. Now, if anybody knows me well, knows that I don't really like to read books. And most books don't pass my throw the book against the wall test. So basically, I'll start reading a book and I can only go so far before I want to throw the book at the wall because I've come across something that's just factually incorrect. And this book, I haven't thrown against the wall, even though actually I'm reading it on Kindle. So it's a virtual book that I would throw at a virtual wall. But it's actually quite good. So what she's got in here is sort of the history of the politics involved with the food pyramid in the US, which sort of matches the Canadian one as well. And she's not just looking at the conventional side and the politics that actually caused them to decide saturated fat was bad and promote, lots of grain eating and stuff like that. She also looks at the other side too, the low carb thing. And basically she goes over why there isn't a lot of information for like real information, real research for any of these things. And this is something that we need to understand, that when people write books, they can cherry pick their way through research. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, and say whatever they like. And there's not a lot to sort of, check them. So if you have a chance to read this, I'm only halfway through it, and so far, so good. I haven't wanted to stop reading it. But I really like the way she writes, and she actually writes in a very entertaining way as well. So in the current era, as I said, the truth doesn't seem to matter anymore. And what we are dealing with clients who are listening to TV or, reading books or listening to different people talk about different things, it's opinion. So this opinion, we're in the opinion era where it just reigns supreme. And consumers are being manipulated emotionally. And first of all, I want to clarify that, because if you've taken any business courses, and I know many of you have, and I've even talked about this myself, that when people make a decision to buy or to come see you or, take advantage of your services, they are doing so from an emotional perspective. They make their decision emotionally first, and then they make a rational decision, or sort of rationalize it later. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just how we buy. And that's a scientific fact. If you talk to marketing people, they'll tell you that. But that's not the same as being manipulated. So again, when you're talking about it from a normal perspective, what you would be doing as practitioners in promoting your services, you would say statements that would help them, let them know that you understand where they're coming from. Right? So you're going to talk about what it's like to be bloated or whatever. And it may be your own perspective, or it may be the perspective you have because you know people, or, there's all kinds of different ways to write this perspective. But when the prospective client reads it, they say, okay, they get me. They understand what I'm going through. I'm going to check out what they have to say. And that's when you tell them about the value of your program, or you're seeing you one-on-one or whatever. That's fine. But that's not being manipulated. Manipulation emotionally is when they focus primarily, and you should watch people do this. Multi-level marketing companies do this really, really well. So they really play on the emotions of what it's like to have lots of money. And more they talk about that in a presentation to get you to sign up for their products, as opposed to the products themselves. And that's just one example. So there's a lot of people out there, and when you have a book, you have a lot of time to emotionally manipulate people, because it's not, a flyer that you put out. It's not a web page they've landed on. It's a book, and it's got lots of information to keep hammering home the same point they want you to have. And so what's happening is that people are becoming much more scared, and they're not trusting what they think they know. And this is what we're dealing with. And of course, for us, it's the client that's sitting in front of us, because they're the ones who are desperate, right? They've come to you because they need someone to help them. But they don't know that they've been manipulated. They don't know that what they're hearing is just a lot of talk. And so it makes it difficult for us to sort of sift through what they think they know to help them find the best choices. Okay, so there's a study that was done, or a survey on consumers. I just thought I'd put this in here because I like statistics and I find this kind of stuff interesting. But basically, the study said that consumers are getting more info from more sources. So it's worse than it used to be. But when they actually test their nutritional literacy to see how much they understand, it's still not very good. And consumers are overwhelmed by the conflicting information that they're hearing. And 78% of the people surveyed noted that this info is conflicting. 56% said this makes them doubt their food choices. And this was done by the International Food and Information Council Foundation, and it was part of their 12th annual Food and Health Survey. Now, they went on to say that 96% seek out health information, which I thought was kind of amazing. That's a very high statistic. And the top reasons are weight loss, heart health, more energy, and digestive health. And that makes a lot of sense, because weight loss and heart health are probably the two most well-known health conditions that people would be aware of. And if you talk to most people and they want to do something about their health, energy would be probably number one. And we're seeing more and more people becoming aware that digestive health should be better than it is, and are seeking that out as well. But when they surveyed those people, they found that despite seeking out the health information, only 45% can identify a single food associated with those benefits. And this was one example they gave, that only 12% could make the association between omega-3 fish oil and heart health, which and omega-3 fish oil for heart health is probably one of the most common pieces of information about, a certain food or even supplement, if you want to look at it that way, but we can also just talk about it as fish, and health relationship. 77% stated that they rely on family and friends for some of their info. It was actually the largest source for information for people. It topped health professionals, news, and the internet. But only 29% had high trust in the info from their friends and family. So they're listening, but they're not necessarily believing. And 59% rated family and friends influencing their eating pattern and food choices. So this isn't even about believing. This is that they may want to make different changes and choices, but they're being, held back, or they can't do exactly what they want because of whoever cooks in the home or whatever their social life is like. So this is something that's confounding things. 55% also cited that health professionals are influencers of their beliefs as well. So that's good news in some cases. And then other factors such as the place of purchase, fresh versus canned or frozen, and price all influence what consumers think is healthier. So if the same food is bought in a health food store versus a convenience store, they think it's healthier in the health food store than in the convenience store. And the same with price. If something's more expensive, they think, even if it's the same item, they think it's healthier than if it's less expensive. In terms of fresh versus canned and frozen, well, it's the definition of fresh. I think we could all agree that a fresh carrot is better than a canned carrot or a frozen carrot, but a lot of the food that's sold fresh, especially prepared foods, aren't really fresh. They weren't just made, and consumers have no notion of that, but they think they're better because they're not frozen or canned. Now, older adults are more confident in their choices. 47% of adults aged 50 to 80 doubt their choices versus 61% of adults 18 to 49. So that's not a huge difference, but it's enough to know that it seems that as people get older, they do, become a little more confident about how things work, which should make sense. I mean, if they've been really trying, then they'll know their bodies a little better than someone who's younger. All right, so the question then becomes, where do you get good information that you can rely on? And I'm just going to check back in here and make sure everybody's good. Everybody's still good. Everybody can hear me. Yay. Okay. So the problem is, we're looking for information that's not misleading. And unfortunately, there's no one spot to go. There's nobody out there who's taken it upon themselves to be the guardian of the information about health. And yes, there are people out there who, they blog on a regular basis, and they are, there's all those skeptic sites, which drive me crazy. And then there's other people who are just trying to, counter information that they hear, but they're coming from their own perspective, and they don't seem to realize that. And we see this a lot because, we are interested in the alternative perspective. So when someone is coming from the conventional perspective and they call, the information on saturated fat the real science, or, they've accepted the conventional perspective as fact, when, again, if you read that book, Death of the Food Pyramid, you'll find out there's not a lot of fact to it. Then if it's contrary to that position, then it must be the bad stuff, and they're out to prove that it's the wrong information. And of course, then you have the alternative perspective, which is saying, well, nobody knows really for sure what's going on, but this is what I think. And they present their information. So there's nobody that's just going to say, you know what, I don't have an opinion, and I'm not stuck in any one camp. And so I'm just going to be that person. And so we're kind of on our own. So you could read all the research, but that means you have to read it all. You can't just read what you want to read. You have to read the counterpoints to whatever you're reading. And that takes a lot of time. So what I do is I find websites that quote studies. And when I say quote studies, I mean they either name them so that you can go find the abstract for them and read it for yourself, or they actually cite them So sometimes they cite them at the bottom. Now what most people are doing is they're just putting little numbers beside a piece of information, and the number's hyperlinked that'll take you to the abstract or the study. Either way, doesn't really matter. You want to know where information came from. So that's a start. That's at least a positive step. But you want to check the owner of the site for bias. So right now we are in a huge era where, people like MDs who are, I'll call them alternative leaning, are really into low carb. And so you have to know that you're going to be getting that bias every time you read something that they write. And it doesn't mean you discount what they write, is that you have to make sure that that their interpretation is correct. One thing you should always avoid, if anyone says it, whether they're speaking or whether they're writing, if they just say studies show and they don't actually talk about what studies. And again, you don't have to talk about the studies as long as you list them at the bottom. Like, you don't have to say this study said X, but you can say a piece of information based on a study, as long as you put the citation at the bottom. Studies show doesn't mean anything. Anybody can say that. And I've read so many things from so many different, doesn't matter if it's supplements or foods or books or whatever, and that's how they justify their position. They just say all the research shows that. And no, all the research doesn't show that, because the one thing we know about research is it likes to contradict itself. So what I tend to do is, if I found a piece of information that interests me, I Google the opposite to see if I can find opposing studies. This saves you a lot of time. So you've read something on a good quality website that does quote studies, and now you want to check it out. And it doesn't even have to be something you like. It could be something you dislike. And you want to see if there's opposing studies. Just Google the opposite. So for example, let's say you wanted to see, you read that, saturated fat was good for people who had dementia, or to help prevent dementia because it protects the brain. If you like that, then Google the opposite and Google study, abstract, saturated fat, dementia, to see if anything comes up that has linked it to dementia. And just for the record, I did do that today. What I found were those kind of studies where people have eaten more saturated fat, therefore, and then they're more likely to have dementia. Mind you, all those people also ate trans fats, which was lumped together with saturated fat in the study. And then I found another study, or studies, that talked about the benefits of cholesterol for protecting the brain. It's the kind of thing, when you start looking at it, you kind of wish you hadn't started, because there's so much conflicting information. But I'm just saying, it's not hard for you to sort of sort through the information just with a quick little Google search. Now, the other thing you want to do is check your bias. So many of you believe what you hear, or at least consider it. I have been asked more times than I can count, somebody saying to me, and I'm talking about practitioners here, well, I heard that. Is this true? And I'm like, well, and then I have to kind of figure out what it is they heard, where they heard it. It seems like I have to do all the work for what they heard to find out whether what they heard has merit or not. So that's a very common thing we do. We are in an information age. We hear all kinds of things. We don't necessarily are paying full attention, and therefore we don't tend to get all the context sometimes, or we don't get all the details. So the question you should ask is, why are you picking up, or little bits of information and why are they sticking in your brain? Because that piece of information had to stick there for a reason. What about that piece of information actually resonated with you so that you remembered it, even though you were only kind of half listening? And if you want to understand your client's belief, right, you have to understand your own first, right? So if you can figure out why you tend to believe things that you hear, or believe pieces of information, even if they're not just simple things that you hear, maybe you actually, went and heard somebody speak in detail about a topic. Why did you believe it? Why is it important for you to believe it? And if you can figure that out for yourself, it'll give you great understanding of why your client is doing that as well. And then the other thing we have to do is develop critical thinking, because we are in the business of listening. So of course we're going to listen to people we think are experts, but we also have to listen to clients. And in both scenarios, we have to listen very critically so that we pick up, what, not just what people are saying to us, but other aspects that could help us understand where they're coming from. Okay. So in terms of your beliefs, what I would suggest you do is, what do you know to be true? So what is true? What does that mean? It means there are certain pieces of information you've been taught that aren't really in question, and it's not about food per se. So when I'm saying this, if you're going to sort of write down what you know to be true, think generally, not specific facts about specific foods, just generally. So for example, you know how the digestive system works pretty much. You may not know it as well as a research scientist or a gastroenterologist knows it, but you know the basics. And I'll give you an example of how that helped me sort through a piece of information. I was, a while back, this is several years ago, I wanted to know where the logic was for food combining when they said to eat fruit by itself. I wanted to see what the original theory was, because I knew too many societies, many ethnic groups who all eat fruits after a meal. And I have a very strong belief in the foods of the past, that they kind of knew better than we know what they were doing. So I looked it up and I found it. And of course, this dates back to the 80s. And what was written was that the reason you eat fruit alone in food combining is because if you don't, then when you eat the fruit, the enzymes in the fruit will be killed by the stomach acid. And because I understood the digestive system, it immediately sort of was a red flag. I'm like, no, that's not the way it works at all, because enzymes, A, are not killed in acid. Enzymes operate, depends what type of enzyme, in either an alkaline or an acid pH. And so, for example, when you chew your food, you have amylase enzymes in your saliva. That's an alkaline environment. And when you swallow and they go into the acid environment of the stomach, the enzyme goes dormant. And then when it goes into the duodenum, right, the pancreas releases bicarbonate, neutralizes the acid, and now the enzymes that were present in the saliva become active again. And because I knew that was what I was reading was false. So that's what I mean about what do you know to be true? And if you are always taking this information and say, okay, what do I know about the brain? What do I know about the gut? What do I know about the heart? Then you can often judge this information a little better than if you just take it at face value. There's a expression called nutritionism. If you want to learn more about it, it's written by a man named Georgi Skrinis. And he coined this term, and what it refers to is the way food is studied and the way dietary interventions are studied. And essentially what we do is we divide the food into parts, study the parts, and then make assumptions about the food. So if you take, vitamin K, when people are on blood thinners, they're told not to eat broccoli because it's got vitamin K in it, and vitamin K is supposed to thin the blood. There's no studies of anyone on a blood thinner eating broccoli. So that's nutritionism, to talk about saturated fat without looking at it. And he doesn't go this far, but I'll go this far. It isn't even the food and studying the food. That would be great. That'd be a step forward instead of studying the parts. But it's also about the meal. What are the other foods in the meal? They count too. And I'm telling you this now. That's going to be an area of research in the future. Is one I'm quite interested in. That it's not just about what a single food does. It's what a food does with other foods in the same meal. Very interesting information. Anyway, if you want to read more about nutritionism, it gives you. It's got a lot of the similar kinds of information that the other book I had in it about the politics of it. But he goes more on the science level from looking at foods as a whole thing as opposed to parts. Anyway, so write down what you know to be true and then start using these when you speak or write about nutrition myths, because this is what's going to help you convince people that perhaps there's a perspective they hadn't considered when they've decided to believe a certain thing. All right, so I'm going to use gluten as an example of what we're talking about because that's probably one of the easiest ones to get information on, and it's probably quite well known. So the whole situation with gluten started because of anecdotal information from early anti-gluten experts. And so they had maybe made this sort of causation or correlation, I should say. It was never a causation. When they were working with clients, or maybe they experienced it themselves. A lot of them, they experienced it themselves. And then they go looking for information. And they cherry pick their way through the research, which most people do. And especially the work of a doctor named Alessio Fasano, who is the foremost expert on celiac disease. And they looked at what he was saying about gluten and then took that and applied that to the general public. But Alessio Fasano was only talking about it with regard to celiac disease. So much so that he actually gets mad when people quote him in the anti-gluten domain or quote his research. He doesn't like it because they are misquoting him and it's not what he's saying at all. And then once this occurred, it's picked up by other experts who are selling programs and books. And then with the help of these free summits that everybody thinks are so wonderful, word spreads. And there's not a lot of depth or discussion about these things. It is primarily just, they're throwing little bits of piece of information at people. And for some reason, it stuck. And so what's happening with the consumers is they're hearing the word over and over again in a negative context. So all of a sudden, they start making this association. They don't understand how the body works. They don't even know what gluten is. I did work for a gluten-free company to develop gluten-free products back in 2013 and 14. And at the beginning stage, they had a store before they turned it into a full bakery. And so I used to hear all these people come in and with their questions, and they didn't have a clue what it was. Some people thought it would help them with their blood sugar and that it made blood sugar swing up and down. They couldn't have gluten because they're diabetic, and like they had it was basically being blamed for everything. So consumers have basically concluded from all this exposure that it's bad or unhealthy. And one of the things you should listen for is when you're watching TV, when you're watching a TV show or a movie or anything like that, how often the word gluten is now thrown in as either a punchline or as part of, the characters, well, I'm gluten free. Like they just toss it out. Same with vegan. I hear vegan a lot too. Or that, carbs are fattening. Like you hear that all the time. And of course, fat, of course, is going to kill you. I don't know how many times I've heard that in a TV show. So this is when it's reached the mass. The masses have now embraced this. And this is when it's sort of been entrenched into people's belief systems. I was watching Dateline a few years ago, and there was somebody who was at the ballpark and it was a gluten-free, they were talking about, this was the topic of the section. And they interviewed this person at the ballpark who was eating a gluten-free hot dog, and they were doing so because they think it would help them lose weight, and it's the healthier option. And what it really takes is sheer repetition. So repetition is a marketing concept, and the more people hear it, the more likely they are to remember it and believe it. What new research is showing, because of course there's always the other side, is they're starting to do studies and they're finding that because people don't really know what gluten is, they don't know how to do it well, and they're eating too many foods that are far less healthy for them than the grains that they stopped eating when they stopped eating gluten. And so this is, again, important for us to know, because we have to help people, if they are going to be gluten-free, to be the best gluten-free people they can be with the best food choices. So here's a study just to give you some thought about this topic. So they took 10 people and they were all healthy. They gave them a gluten-free diet for 1 month. They measured their good bacteria and found that it had decreased. They measured their bad bacteria, found it had a parallel increase. So it literally, good bacteria went down as bad bacteria went up. And they also found immune system response had decreased. So this goes back to what I was just saying. You need to know what you're taking out. I understood it as soon as I read this. I knew exactly why this happened, because the grains that contain gluten also contain resistant starch, which is an excellent food for gut bacteria. And if you don't replace that when you take the gluten-free grains out, this is exactly what's going to happen. So this is I think, a role for us to play, and this is the kind of information that people need to understand. Is they don't really know what they're doing. I don't know what they think about food, but they don't really have a good sense of what qualifies as quantity or quality or benefits for the body. And then this is another study. So this study was based on an original study, an Australian study in 2011 that seemed to prove the existence of gluten sensitivity based on a small study. So the same researchers decided to test their own results. And they took 37 self-identified gluten-sensitive people. And basically what they did is gave them all their food for the duration of the trial. So they got every single meal given to them. And they had removed any potential dietary triggers for gastrointestinal symptoms. So that they removed, milk products because of lactose, certain preservatives like benzoates and propionate, sulfites, nitrates. And they also removed the fermentable, poorly absorbed short-chain carbohydrates, which are also known as FODMAPs. But to those of us who are gut savvy, we know those as prebiotic foods. And they're a certain type of prebiotic food, so they didn't remove all the prebiotics, but fermentable, that's exactly what that means. It's fermented by the colon bacteria, and poorly absorbed is why it gets fermented by the colon bacteria, because it's not absorbed into the body as carbohydrates. So it's amazing how they describe this as a negative, but actually these foods are quite a positive. They also had 9 days worth of urine and fecal matter collected so that they could measure different markers in both urine and the stool. And then the subjects were cycled through a high gluten, low gluten, and no gluten diets. So all subjects got all three at one point, and they didn't know which diet plan they were on at any given time. And the results, all of the treatment diets, even the placebo diet, caused pain, bloating, nausea, and gas to a similar degree. And it didn't matter if the diet contained gluten or not. So what researchers concluded was that this is the nocebo effect. And nocebo is described as a harmless thing that causes harm because you believe it's harmful. And so you have all these people who know that one of the diets is probably going to have gluten, and they had such a belief system that they managed to make all the diets make them feel poorly. And of course, they were more attentive because they're paying attention to this because they're on the study. But it just goes to show that often people can have reactions. And by the way, their fecal and urine tests showed no changes of any kind. So what people can make themselves believe that something causes them symptoms and actually experience the symptoms. And I think that's an important thing that we have to keep in mind. So again, if we want to continue with our gluten example, how do clients decide to remove gluten? Well, in some case, it's just intuition or fear. It feels like something they should do. Sometimes it's logic. If gluten is bad for people with celiac disease, then they think maybe it's bad, period. No question. It's bad for everybody. Celebrity endorsement, that's a big one. So many people are influenced by people they admire, and they try it just for that reason. Anecdotes. We know testimonials are powerful. We use them in our promotional material to help people come and see us as client. So when people hear that someone has had success with symptoms after eliminating gluten, it's difficult to ignore. And then, of course, marketing. And this is the big one. It's a science, and never, ever forget that. And it's designed to convince. So you've got gluten-free books and products and about gluten-free diets, and these can be very, very convincing despite the fact there's little science to back it up. So now we have, I think it depends what articles you read and what time frame, anywhere up to 30% of people removing gluten, and probably It's about 3% of the population is celiac, and maybe another 10 that is possibly gluten sensitive, legitimately so. And it might not even be gluten sensitive. It could be merely wheat sensitive because they eat it too much and they don't have enough good bacteria to digest the food properly, and they get symptoms as a result, and they blame the gluten. It might not actually be the gluten at all. We've kind of skipped over that step. So this is what we're dealing with, and this is what you're dealing with when clients come to you. So how do you counter the myths? First of all, you kind of think about who you're attracting and why. So do you have like a certain type of client? I think we do as a profession attract a certain type of person. And what I have found with my fellow colleagues, when I've asked them this, I actually did this at a table of 12 nutritionists. I asked, do you always find you're getting the same type of person? And they all said yes. I said, how many of them that are coming to you have the same issues you have? And they said, most of them. So we do tend to attract what we are focused on. I've talked to other people who maybe don't have health issues, and what they find is they start, as they get more knowledge on a given topic, they start attracting people for that topic, and then they get interested in another topic and they start attracting people with that topic. So we do tend to attract a certain type of client. But from a food myths perspective, I think they kind of fall into two categories. So the first category is people who are more likely to be trying new things. This is who's showing up at your door. They've often been disappointed with other protocols or other practitioners, and they tend to be more well-read. So these people are going to have opinions about what foods they should or shouldn't eat. They're going to ask you a lot of questions. The good news is that they are open to trying new things. So that means that if you find the right way to present it to them, they would be open to trying what you have to say. The other type are people who are completely clueless, and they're easily influenced by everything they hear. And you know this type I found myself in this position. They're asking me a question, and then before I can finish answering the question, they ask me another question, and they just jump from question to question to question. In either case, they often have belief systems that are going to make it difficult for you to try and help them. Okay, so how do we change their beliefs? So you're dealing with their fears, right? If they've removed a certain food or foods from their diet, there's some aspect of fear surrounding this. And at some point, you're going to have to confront them. It's not something you would do at the start, and you can wait until the time is right. But the key is going to be a mixture of education and then changing their belief. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. To change belief, it's a combination of 3 steps. The first is listen for false beliefs. Most people have some attachment to their belief system. I don't care what the topic is. It could be food, it could be anything. And that makes perfect sense. We are emotional beings. In order for you to kind of figure out where it's coming from, you're going to have to listen to them, because over time they will tell you information that makes it clear why they believe what they believe. For most, though, it's a question of whether or not they know the truth. So call it a fear of not knowing the truth. And a lot of times they're opting for the position that is going to keep them safe, right? So if they don't eat it, well, I don't have to worry about it. So I don't know what the truth is, but I don't have to worry about it because I'm not eating it. Okay, why are you doing that? Whoops. I will talk about the IgG blood tests at the end, because if you attended the webinar I did in December, you already know the answer I'm going to give to that, but it's worth reminding people, because that's one of the reasons people are getting misled. So we'll talk about IgG blood testing at the end. Okay. So number 2 is, what does the client need to do to dissolve or redefine this belief? So at some point, if they've removed a food and you think that food might actually help them, they're going to have to have a new belief around that food. So what are they going to need to do? And we'll talk about that in a second. And this is where education and different cooking techniques can help, because sometimes it's not what they were eating, it was how they were eating it, the version they were eating, the way it was prepared, etc. And then number 3 is set up a new experience to disprove their old belief. And that's going to be when you've actually have confronted them and convinced them to try the new food. And it could be trying it in a new way, right? A different way of eating it, or it could be recommending a new food that is similar, something that is going to sort of lower their guard and make them feel comfortable trying it and not think the world is going to come to an end if they eat this food. It's important, though, that the client knows that the two of you are working on this together and that you're just trying to find the best answers for them, that you're not going to you're not dictating, you're not discounting their beliefs, you're not taking them seriously. So they need to see you as a partner. Okay, so when it comes to challenging their beliefs, you need to ask them how they believe it is working for them. And I don't mean this in the Dr. Phil way, where he says, so how's that working for you? I don't mean that. I mean, sincerely, how is it working, how they believe it's working for them? Like, what is it doing for them? What is the quality of their life like having removed this food? You need to get a sense of whether this is bothering them or not, and whether it's becoming more stressful for them because they've done this. And we see this with people who've been to NDs and they've removed a lot of foods and they are just beside themselves and their quality of life is terrible. You could, I'm a big fan of food journals, see if that yields any clues. A lot of times what we see when people are making these choices to remove certain foods, they don't actually replace them with other foods and they end up not eating very well. And you'll see that in the food journal just by seeing how sporadically they eat or how unbalanced they eat. And basically you're looking, when you're going through this process, you're just looking for a flaw in their thinking, and hopefully that will provide you with a motive for changing again. So if you can figure out why they did it in the first place, and I don't mean just from a symptom perspective, there's some other reason, there's another reason there, then what is the motive that's going to help them change again? Because that's what you want them to do. So I'm going to use grains as the example because that's the one that came up in the healthy gut community. And so we might as well talk about that one because that's a big one right now. So first thing you need to do is learn what they think they know. So you need to understand what it is they've been told about grains that has caused them to not eat them. Why did they remove them, or why did they think they should? Now, if they have removed them, do not ask if it helped. Because if you do that, you are giving power to the fact that it might have helped. That's biasing them. So don't ask them. Just say, why did you remove the grains? Or why did you think you should remove the grains? Just to hear their story and to hear what information they have. It will come out on their own if it helped them or not. So just let it come out on its own. And then what you want to do is start developing a pattern of talking where you link grains to helping their health issue. So this is a situation where you think they need to eat grains. So let's say their health issue is they have headaches, and you can see that their blood sugar swings up and down. And so you feel that if they had a more substantial type of grain that could stabilize blood sugar and sustain energy for a long period of time, that this would keep their blood sugar stable and hopefully help their headaches. So when you're having this conversation, because they came to you with headaches, this is a concern of theirs, you just start by just calmly saying, you don't go, okay, well, if you ate grains, that would help your headaches, because that's obviously going to put them on edge. You just talk to them and say, you could be getting headaches because, you're having highs and lows in your energy throughout the day. And you sort of point out where they've indicated that in questionnaires or whatever. And there's some foods that can help you with that. And they'll say, okay, what foods would help me? Well, there's grains and there's legumes and there's cinnamon and there's Jerusalem artichoke. And so you didn't say eat grains, you just keep mentioning it, right? You're trying to counter myths they have about grains. And so you have to counter it with new information that went, wait a minute, a grain could help me with something? But you didn't come out right and say it because they're not ready yet. They're not ready to hear that. And if the need to fix their health issue is greater than their fear of the food, believe me, they're going to be much more open to trying the grains again than keeping them out of their diet. So, if it's not, so this health issue is not so overwhelming for them, then you're going to have to go through very slow with the education. So what I just described to you, where I just said, oh yeah, no, the foods that help blood sugar are grains and legumes. Okay, that is called the art of the mention. You're just mentioning. And the more times you mention grains in a positive light, the more, remember, it's repetition, 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 but you're not bashing them over the head with it. You're just mentioning it. And it'll start to sink in after a while. And as they start hearing these various pieces of information, you're actually countering the programming of whatever made them think they should remove grains in the first place. And remember that the fear they have of grains came about for the exact same reason. They kept hearing over and over again that the grains should be removed. So it's the same process. You're just doing it in reverse. So this is an exercise you can do with clients. I call it the perfect world exercise. So basically what you want them to do is describe the foods they would choose to eat if all foods are good for you. So there's no foods that are off limit. You can eat whatever your taste buds desire. They're all good for you. What would be on that list? And you ask for them to make a list. So in other words, there's no such thing as a bad food. And make them write it all down. And then you want to split the list into, you don't show them this, but you split this into two lists. Ones are foods you want them to eat and foods you don't want them to eat, but you don't show them that. And then what you're going to look for, because we're doing the grains example, you could do the same thing with fat. You could do the same things with, tomatoes, whatever the foods are they're avoiding. See, we're just talking about grains right here. So see what grains are on the list. Now, by this time, they will have told you if removing them has helped or not. So this is not something you do right away. This is after you've gotten to know them a bit. And so now you see that if they had the choice, if they were really following what their palate was telling them, they would eat grains. So now you know that in their heart of hearts, they want to eat grains. They are now looking for a reason to go back to having them, right? So they've been scared to not have them, and now they want to go back to having them. So if they actually had a digestive issue with the grains and that they felt better, then what you want to do as you're encouraging them to try a grain is to add steps to the protocol to help them. So that could be a digestive enzymes, and there are ones specifically for both carbohydrates and gluten and all kinds of things that you can get. It could be, fermenting the grains. There's all kinds of trying new grains they haven't tried before. There's all kinds of things you could do to help them if they had an issue. And if they didn't, of course, then that makes it just much easier. And then you want to create a scenario where they can have the grain. So maybe you just say, well, since that's on your perfect world list, why don't you have it once a week? Maybe once every 3 days, depending on what you think is appropriate or how willing they are. And you can kind of make it like a treat. And if you do this, over time, they will overcome the fear, because if they didn't really have a problem with it, they're going to figure that out because they eat it once a week or every 3 days. If they do have a problem and you've created a scenario where they don't have a problem now because you added some steps to the protocol, they're going to figure that out as well. And this will really help them actually put the foods back in when they are not willing to do so just from you making a simple suggestion to do so. Now, another option is to teach them about different versions of the food, something they do not know. So a lot of what they are making their decisions on are based on what they know. So the minute you start teaching them things they do not know, then this could be helpful. So again, if we're going to use grains as the example, most people don't know that and again, this has happened so many times I can't tell you, where I've had people who've removed gluten from their diet and then they try sourdough and they feel better with the gluten out. Then they try sourdough and they have no reaction whatsoever. This is not saying there isn't gluten in sourdough, which somebody said recently at a webinar that somehow they think people are saying sourdough has no gluten. Nobody is saying that. Nobody ever said that. What we're saying is that the people who removed gluten didn't really need to remove gluten. It was probably a wheat sensitivity. And with sourdough, it's more digestible because the protein and the starches are being broken down in the fermentation process somewhat, not completely. Or you can ferment grains, is just another way. Something else you can do is, instead of wheat, have einkorn, spelt, or kamut. Einkorn's my new favorite flour. And if you want to try a really cool flour, I would suggest you try it. But this is what we used to do back in the early 2000s, before the anti-gluten thing sprouted up. If we came across somebody we suspected might have a wheat sensitivity, we did not make them go gluten-free. We switched them to spelt or kamut first. Einkorn wasn't around. And if they could digest those with no symptoms, then we knew that it was just they were eating too much wheat and, there was a gut bacteria issue going on and that sort of thing. So much better and so much easier for them, because in those days, because there was no anti-gluten thing going on, spelt and kamut were in a lot of products and quite easy to find. And they're still quite easy to find, but you can see that they've been hurt by the whole anti-gluten thing. Now einkorn is the new favorite. First of all, it's kind of blonde in color, so it substitutes well for white flour. It's very soft, like cake and pastry flour, so you're not going to get the same kind of texture you're going to get from white wheat flour, but it predates all of them. So spelt and kamut are ancient grains. Einkorn's even older than all of them. It's older than wheat, older than spelt, older than kamut. And a lot of people who have big time issues with gluten allergies or anything like that, have no problem with einkorn. So it's well worth people trying. And, when you give people a little bit of hope, these people, if they are really suffering and really have health issues related to something like a grain or gluten or whatever, when you give them an option that might work for them, you're not misleading them and you're not building up their hopes for nothing. They're used to something probably not working, but it's well worth trying if it's going to make their life better and the quality of their food better. So because this is new info for them, and it's not just the opposite of what they believe, it actually does a lot to help change their opinion about a topic, because you can't really slot this information into what they have been told by the people who convinced them not to eat grains in the first place. Because they don't talk about sourdough, they don't talk about fermenting grains, and they certainly don't talk about einkorn flour. So anytime you want to convince somebody about information, if we wanted to look at fat, for example, you could talk about essential fatty acids and those benefits. So somebody who's totally anti-fat, it's really easy to just talk about what the benefits of essential fatty acids, say, well, you really need these, and here's what's going to happen, when you have your essential fatty acids, your hair is going to be nicer and your brain's going to function. And, so different information that they don't have helps them have new opinions. So the key here is to think, what do they not know about food? And then start educating them so that they'll have some new ideas and a different perspective than what they've had currently. And you have to consider what info is going to make a difference for them. So what can you tell them that's going to be new to them and not be just the opposite of what they currently believe? You may have to do your own research for this, but your best clues are going to come from them. So a lot of time listening to them and figuring out why they believe what they believe is going to help you come up with the solutions that you need. All right. So I'm going to come back to you now, and I'm going to turn off screen share in one shot. Oh my God, how did I do that? Okay, so I will take any questions that you have, and I will start with Dawn's question, which is, if you've had a blood test through for IgG for gluten, does that mean you have a gluten sensitivity? And the answer is no. So, and this is the big myth of the IgG tests. And if you want, Dawn, if you email me, I'll send you a link to the webinar I did in December where I went over this in a lot greater detail. But essentially, all an IgG test tells you is the presence of IgG antibodies. But what the test cannot tell you is if you react to those, or those antibodies are causing a reaction. They can only tell you that they're there. And there's something called Treg cells that help regulate reaction. And if you have sufficient Treg cells for the number of IgG antibodies you have, you will not react. And so IgG does not tell you reaction, it tells you presence. And what the assumption is, and again, it is a big assumption, is that if you have enough of these, then maybe you're probably reacting. So they could be, you could use an IgG test as a tool, but in no way is it a fact. And that's what's being, again, lost on the public. And again, it's partly because MDs and NDs do not make that distinction. They don't even understand it. And I got this information by talking, again, to the researchers. Researchers are fabulous people to talk to because they won't make assumptions. They will tell you what they know as based on the research that they've done. And when you talk to any researchers, and I talk to different ones about IgG testing, there isn't one that will tell you that it's definitive for a reaction, and that you always have to take into consideration the person and their immune system and how it functions before you can ever determine whether someone's going to react to something. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that's helpful. Sally's asking if there's a recording. I'm sure she's left by now because she says she had to leave. And yes, there's always a recording, and it's always sent out. Milka's asking, can you please provide the source for the study, number one, the gluten-free study and its impact on the microbiome? I kind of scrolled past it, but I listed the, when I send out the replay tomorrow, I will do a PDF of the slides, and it's on the bottom of that slide. You'll see the reference there. Henny, hi Henny. Do you focus in healing gut even before talking about reintroducing the culprit? Well, again, you just assume that the culprit is actually a culprit. So first we have to establish that the culprit's a culprit. We're talking about their belief system. So sometimes they just think it's a culprit. It's not really a culprit. So your first job is to find out if it actually was causing them any symptoms or is causing them any symptoms. Obviously, if it's causing them symptoms, you do want to fix the gut. And you're going to use reintroducing the foods as a test to sort of help them show that they're getting improvement. Bonnie is asking, in terms of research, is it appropriate to take certain information from a book written by an expert researcher instead of reading all the research yourself? If it's from the researcher, then it has more credibility than if it's from a doctor or an ND. But when I say researcher, you want to see they've done a number of studies. Like a lot of these researchers, when they get interested in a topic, they do study after study after study after study. If you read the work of Alessio Fasano, you see how many studies he's done. He's right now branching beyond celiac disease because his interest is autoimmunity, not gluten. He's not interested in gluten. So he wants to, so he's looking at different aspects with autoimmunity in general. So yeah, if it's a researcher, but again, you still have to take their perspective. If they're trying to convince you of a personal or perspective, you have to ask yourself why they're trying to convince you of that perspective. And it's not that that's necessarily a bad thing. Like I said, if you read this book that I recommended, she cites study after study after study after study after study. It's really quite good. it, it's you just have to take it into context. That's all. So I prefer researchers over MDs who write books, or NDs who talk about their patients. I much prefer the researchers. And when I've gone to conferences and seminars, I find that what the researchers say is far more even comprehensive and sensible than when you hear the MDs or the NDs or, the practitioners speak. So Karen is asking, so you are not saying gluten is not necessary to remove from the diet in somebody with an overactive immune system. I am absolutely saying that. Absolutely. Gluten and autoimmunity have no connection. None. Autoimmunity is a product of lack of immune tolerance. Immune tolerance is regulated by gut bacteria. If someone has, see, this is, and again, I keep referencing this book, but she makes the point as well, but causation and correlation are two different things. So you have somebody who has an autoimmune condition. That means they have a gut problem. People with gut problems often have food sensitivities or issues with food. So you remove, for example, let's say they have an issue with gluten. You remove the gluten, some symptoms disappear. Not their autoimmune condition, that doesn't disappear, but some symptoms disappear. And now you've got a whole bunch of people running around saying, oh, gluten and autoimmunity are connected. No, there's a correlation, and the correlation is it's called a confounding variable from a research perspective. There's something else that's in between that is causing both, and it turns out that it's the gut. That's where we are today. We may find there's even more information to it later on, but that's where we are today. We don't have a solution for it per se, but we're at least finding that this regulatory ability of the gut for autoimmunity exists, and this is why they're connecting more and more autoimmune conditions to specific strains of bad bacteria in the gut, not to gluten. So you may have a client who has a gluten issue and has an autoimmune condition, but I've met a lot of people who have no gluten issues whatsoever, and they have an autoimmune condition. So one's not related to the other, but both can exist in the same person. So I hope that makes sense. Regarding food combining, I learned that fruit on an empty stomach is digested within 30 to 45 minutes. When combined with a meal with protein, it will ferment in the stomach, cause bloating, since it will take much longer to exist. That's basically the more modern perspective, Mary. That is kind of what I was taught as well. And I don't know that that's true either. I do know that acid fruits help you digest protein. So I think it's going to be something you do on a case-by-case basis. I don't believe that there's any one right way to eat. I think what our role is as practitioners is we have different options for clients, and we help them try different options to see which ones work for them the best, because we don't know which one is going to work for them the best. So if food combining works for them, great. Let's make sure they eat properly. If it doesn't, or if it doesn't seem to make a difference, then that's not the answer. Or if they find they actually feel better when they have some fruit with their meal, then maybe that's the answer for them too. But the logic that you have there, that's not in the books. That's not in the original food combining theory. But that one I've heard, and it has more sense to me. I won't say that it's true for everybody, but it has more sense to it than what the original food combining reason for fruit alone was. And I was laughing earlier about Joanne saying, crap, forgot the webinar. We'll catch the replay tomorrow. Melody saying, not all researchers are equal, though. I just read a study that compared olive oil, soil, and palm oils, which said they all damage the endothelial lining of the cardiovascular system, didn't specify quality of oils or other foods eaten, but their conclusions was that it was the oils that did the damage. This is a very, very valid point, Melody, and this goes back to what I was saying about what Georgie Skrinis talks about nutritionism. So these are the kind of studies that you have to be on alert for, because they are the ones where somebody is just taking an element and they're studying it in a usually lab circumstance, usually to a mouse or a rat or something like that, and making a conclusion about it. We don't drink olive oil. We don't take palm oil off of a spoon. We don't, you know what I mean? Like this is not how we ever consume them. And without taking them in context. So for example, let's look at olive oil. So olive oil is more prone to rancidity. And so is soy oil, I might also add. And what we know is that there's rancidity that occurs inside the body. So it's not just about what happens when you cook with it or heat it. It's also your own body, because we're 98.6, so we're quite warm. So it's more prone to free radical damage. It does have some natural antioxidants in it, but not a lot. But when you combine olive oil, and there are studies that show this, that when you combine olive oil with, say, rosemary or things like that, it prevents it from going rancid. So again, if we look at a recipe, you don't have olive oil by itself, but you'll have garlic in it, which has a lot of antioxidants. You'll have herbs in there that have antioxidants. There's other protective oils in there. A lot of saturated fat is protective. I'm shocked about the palm oil. I'd have to read that study. If you can send that to me, Melody, I'd like to look at it just to see exactly how they designed it. You do have to be wary of how studies are designed. And this is where this nutritionism concept comes in. You can't look at oils by themselves. You can't look at anything by themselves. It's how we consume it is all that is relevant, right? Bonnie's saying it's interesting in that many people in my niche have gone gluten-free because they have heard it is good for brain health. Even though they haven't noticed a difference, they still continue to be gluten-free since they're convinced it is bad for them. Gluten is actually what they, I don't know if they do it anymore, but originally this is what they added when they were creating formulas to help people who were in countries where they were suffering from starvation, to try and rebuild their cells and help them recover faster. They gave them some type of powder, to forget what the substance is. They would mix it with water and eat it as food, and it was loaded with gluten because gluten actually aids cell repair and promotes growth. And so this is how twisted the information has gotten, that we've taken this protein, we've labeled it as bad because some people have a trouble digesting it, and we've lost the fact that it actually had a benefit, let alone the fact that wheat has many nutrients and things in it that are beneficial. So this is the problem with where we're at. We keep, it's kind of the same thing with saturated fat, right? It's the same argument with saturated fat, where we totally lost about all the benefits of saturated fat while they were busy trying to label it as bad, and all people understand is good versus bad. So Lisa's saying you referred to a book a couple of times. Is it the one by Georgie or another? So there's two books that I referred, talked about. One is called Death of a Pyramid by Denise Minger, and you'll see that when you see the PDF slides tomorrow. And the other one is called Nutritionism by Georgie Skrinas. Both of them talk about how research has been misinterpreted, or there hasn't even been involved in a lot of decisions that have determined our health picture and what would be good for health. Basically, from reading these books, what I've determined or sort of believe is that nobody really knows what we should be eating. That's kind of where I'm at right now. And we are kind of on our own, and we have to experiment as human beings on ourselves, try different combinations of foods, and figure out what works for ourselves. And if we do that, and this is the approach we take, this is where people are going to need our help, because this suits our profession very well, that they can sort of experiment with themselves to figure out the best approach, and they can use our knowledge to help them, with steps to take. Sylvia says, in the digestive, our school's handbook, in the digestive system, it is written there where eating fruit on an empty stomach is for good digestion. Yeah, that's for good digestion of the fruit, not good digestion of other foods. So I know that acid fruits help you digest other foods, especially protein. So again, it's up to, again, and by the way, that book is just written by somebody. This is the problem with books. Books are written by people. And depending on what they read and where they got their information from determines what they put in a book. And I'm not saying that means you discount all books, because obviously you don't want to do that or you wouldn't have any fun. But it's important that we take the books in context. Kayla's saying, I would love to get more information about IgG testing. Isn't the best measure of sensitivity. Can you point me in the right direction to find that? Which webinar are we? Okay, I will put the link for that webinar. When I send out the link for this replay, I'll put in the link for that one, since we've been talking about it in this webinar. Kathy says, I love my fruit with oatmeal crisp with loads of cinnamon on top, and no way will I ever give that up. So my cooked fruit will always party with grain. I just had a delicious salad and I put an orange in it. I love fruit with things. Bonnie says, how do you know when you've done enough research on a topic? In my past career, I had to access to many research databases. Do you subscribe to any databases to access full articles, or is it sufficient to use abstracts? I don't have any access to any databases that are paid. I refuse to pay. Sometimes if you Google enough times, you can find the study for free. Sometimes I can find other studies that have referred to the study that I'm looking for, and I can get like a lot of review studies are often put available for free, and you can often get the information you're looking for in one study from reading a review study. And it's frustrating not to have access to the databases, but again, there's so many that you could have access to that you would have to pay for, and unless you're, earning a living doing that, then it's really not financially worth your while. Some abstracts are better than others. Some tell you enough information that you can understand exactly what they did and how they did it. Others are really poorly written, and there may not be enough. And Henny says, I owe you a big thank you for what you suggested to me 2 weeks ago. You are the best. Thank you, Henny. Thank you for saying that. I don't remember what I told you, but I'm sure when I see you next, you'll tell me what I told you. So I could probably figure it out if I thought back hard enough. All right, so I don't see any more questions here. You guys have been great as always. I love the way you ask intelligent questions and contribute good pieces of information. And I will be sending out this PDF version of the slides plus the replay tomorrow. And I will also include the IgG replay, because some people I know were there and others weren't. All right, everyone. You have a great rest of your evening. I don't know what you plan to do, but whatever it is, I hope it's relaxing and that you enjoy yourself. And thank you very much for attending.